The echoing halls of the White House felt less like a home and more like a museum to Barron Trump. Sunlight streamed through towering windows, illuminating priceless artifacts and historical portraits, but it couldn't penetrate the loneliness that clung to him like a second skin. At 12, he should have been laughing with friends, engrossed in video games, or dreaming up adventures. Instead, he was surrounded by formality, protocol, and the ever-present weight of his father's position. School was no escape. Classmates whispered behind his back, their gazes lingering on him with a mixture of curiosity and resentment. He was the president's son, a label that overshadowed everything else he was, a kid who liked to draw, who struggled with math, who longed for genuine connection. "Hey, Barron," a voice called out during art class. It was Mrs. Winters, his art teacher. She had a warm smile and eyes that crinkled at the corners when she laughed, which wasn't often enough. "Hi, Mrs. Winters," Barron mumbled, trying to blend into the background. He was working on a charcoal sketch of the Lincoln Memorial, but the lines felt stiff and lifeless. "How's it coming?" she asked, gently pulling up a stool beside him. "It's okay, I guess." Mrs. Winters studied his sketch, her expression thoughtful. "I see the detail, Barron, but it's missing something. It needs heart." He sighed. "Everything I do is missing heart. It's like I'm just going through the motions." "That's not true," Mrs. Winters said softly. "You're talented, Barron. But talent alone isn't enough. You have to put yourself into your work, connect with it on an emotional level." Her words resonated with him, a small spark igniting in the darkness. He rarely talked about his feelings, but something about Mrs. Winters made him want to open up. "It's just hard," he admitted. "Everyone sees me as the president's son, not as Barron. They expect me to be perfect, to know everything. But I don't." Mrs. Winters placed a hand on his shoulder. "Barron, being perfect isn't about never making mistakes. It's about learning from them, about growing. And as for what others think, that's their problem, not yours. You are intelligent, kind, and have a unique perspective." She took his charcoal and gently added a few strokes to his sketch, softening the harsh lines. "There. Now, tell me about what you feel when you look at the Lincoln Memorial." Barron stared at the drawing. I feel like he's watching over us, reminding us to be better." "Exactly," Mrs. Winters smiled. "Now, put that feeling into your art." The bell rang, signaling the end of class. As students filed out, Mrs. Winters stopped Barron. "I know it's not easy, Barron, but you're not alone. If you ever need to talk, I'm here." Her words were a lifeline, a promise of understanding in a sea of judgment. For the first time in a long time, Barron felt a glimmer of hope. He had found someone who saw him, not just the label he carried. That evening, alone in his sprawling bedroom, Barron continued to sketch. This time, the lines flowed more freely, imbued with the emotion Mrs. Winters had encouraged. He was still the president's son, but perhaps, just perhaps, he could also be Barron. Barron had forgotten his geometry textbook in Mrs. Winters' classroom. Reluctantly, he retraced his steps after school, the grand hallways feeling even more cavernous without the bustling energy of students. He pushed open the door to the art room, expecting to find it empty, but he heard Mrs. Winters' voice, strained and pleading. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He shouldn't be eavesdropping, but something in her tone kept him rooted to the spot. "Mr. Henderson, I understand that the rent is due, but I'm asking for just a few more days. I promise, I'll have the money by the end of the week." There was a pause, and then a gruff voice on the other end of the line. "Mrs. Winters, this is the third time. I can't keep making exceptions. You know the terms." I know," she said, her voice cracking. I've been working extra shifts at the coffee shop on weekends, but it's still not enough. Please, just a few more days. Barron's stomach churned. Mrs. Winters, his kind, supportive teacher, working at a coffee shop. It didn't make sense. She always looked so composed, so in control. He heard her sigh, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of the world. Thank you, Mr. Henderson. I appreciate it. She hung up the phone, and Barron quickly ducked out of sight, pretending to browse the student artwork displayed on the walls. He heard her rustling papers, trying to regain her composure. When he finally emerged, he held up his textbook as if he'd just found it. Oh, hi, Mrs. Winters. I forgot this. She managed a weak smile. No problem, Barron. Just be careful next time. He nodded, his mind racing. The image of her pleading on the phone wouldn't leave him. He couldn't imagine Mrs. Winters struggling like that. She deserved so much better. Back in the White House, surrounded by opulence, Barron felt a pang of guilt. He had everything he could ever want, while Mrs. Winters was worried about paying rent. He knew he couldn't just stand by and do nothing. He had to help her, but how? That night, he couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned, replaying the conversation in his head. He had to find a way to use his own talents, his own resources, to make a difference. He just needed a plan. Barron had always kept his art a secret, a private escape from the public eye. But the thought of Mrs. Winters struggling ignited a fire within him. He knew he had to use his talent to help her, even if it meant stepping outside his comfort zone. The next day, during art class, he approached Mr. Reed, the school's eccentric art teacher. Mr. Reed had wild, gray hair and paint-splattered clothes, and he always encouraged his students to express themselves without reservation. Mr. Reed, Barron said hesitantly. I was wondering if I could talk to you about something. Of course, Barron, Mr. Reed replied with a twinkle in his eye. What's on your mind? Barron explained Mrs. Winters' situation, his voice barely above a whisper. He then revealed his plan, to create a series of paintings depicting famous landmarks in Washington, D.C., sell them, and use the money to help her. Mr. Reed listened intently, his expression changing from surprise to admiration. Barron, that's a wonderful idea. It shows great compassion and initiative. And I know you have the talent to pull it off. He paused. But why the secrecy? Why not just ask for help directly? I don't want Mrs. Winters to feel embarrassed or indebted to me, Barron explained. I want to help her without her even knowing it's me. Mr. Reed nodded in understanding. I respect that. I'll help you in any way I can. We can use the school's art studio after hours, and I can provide you with the materials you need. With Mr. Reed's support, Barron felt a surge of confidence. He also enlisted the help of his two closest friends, Samuel and Mason. Samuel was a computer whiz, and Mason was a natural leader. Together, they formed a secret team dedicated to helping Mrs. Winters. We can organize an art exhibition, Samuel suggested. We'll create a website, send out invitations, and promote it on social media. And we can set up a fund specifically for teachers in need, Mason added. We'll call it the Educators Assistance Fund. Barron felt a surge of gratitude. He wasn't alone in this. His friends were willing to risk everything to help someone they cared about. The plan was set: paint the landmarks, organize the exhibition, and establish the fund. They would work in secret, ensuring that Mrs. Winters never suspected a thing. It was a daunting task, but Barron was determined to succeed. He had a mission, and he wouldn't rest until Mrs. Winters was safe and secure. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Barron spent hours in the art studio, sketching and painting. He poured his heart and soul into each canvas, trying to capture the beauty and history of the city he called home. Samuel and Mason worked tirelessly on the logistics of the exhibition, securing a venue, designing invitations, and managing the website. They became a well-oiled machine, each playing a crucial role in the secret operation. As the exhibition date approached, Barron felt a mixture of excitement and anxiety. Would anyone actually come? Would they like his paintings? Would they raise enough money to make a difference? He didn't know the answers, but he had to believe that they could succeed. For Mrs. Winters, he would do anything. The night of the art exhibition arrived like a dream. The school gymnasium, transformed with soft lighting and elegantly arranged canvases, buzzed with anticipation. Barron, disguised in a simple suit and tie, nervously surveyed the crowd from a hidden corner. Samuel and Mason, radiating confidence, greeted guests and directed them to the donation table. To his surprise, the turnout was incredible. Local dignitaries, art enthusiasts, and even some of his father's acquaintances mingled among the students and teachers. The murmurs of admiration grew louder as people examined Barron's paintings. His renditions of the Washington Monument bathed in moonlight, the vibrant cherry blossoms framing the tidal basin, and the stoic presence of the Lincoln Memorial evoked gasps of appreciation. "These are truly remarkable," he overheard a wealthy patron saying to Mr. Reed. "The artist has a remarkable eye for detail and a deep understanding of light and shadow." Barron felt a swell of pride, quickly followed by a wave of guilt. He couldn't take credit for his work openly, but it was enough to know that his art was making a difference. As the evening progressed, the donations poured in. People were touched by the story of the Educators Assistance Fund and the dedication of the young artist behind the paintings. By the end of the night, Samuel announced the total, $3,200. Barron felt a surge of relief. It wasn't enough to solve all of Mrs. Winters' problems, but it was a significant start. They were one step closer to helping her. However, amidst the success, a seed of doubt began to sprout. A few teachers, observing the unusual generosity of the community, exchanged suspicious glances. They whispered among themselves, questioning the source of the funds and the true intentions behind the exhibition. "It's strange, isn't it?" Mrs. Davies, the stern history teacher, said to Mrs. Henderson, the school counselor. "Where did all this money come from all of a sudden?" "I don't know," Mrs. Henderson replied, her brow furrowed. "But I can't help but wonder if there's more to this than meets the eye." The whispers reached Mr. Reed, who, in turn, confided in Barron. "Barron, some of the teachers are getting suspicious. They're starting to ask questions about the fund and the origin of the money." Barron's heart sank. He had been so focused on the positive impact of the exhibition that he hadn't considered the potential for scrutiny. "What should we do?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. "We need to be careful," Mr. Reed advised. "We can't afford to let Mrs. Winters find out about this. It could ruin everything." Barron nodded, his mind racing. They had to protect their secret, even if it meant facing suspicion and doubt. The stakes were too high. Mrs. Winters' well-being depended on it. He knew this was only the beginning, and that the challenges ahead would be even greater. The following week was a nerve-wracking dance of deception. Barron tried to act normal around Mrs. Winters, but every conversation felt like walking a tightrope. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching him, trying to decipher his motives. One afternoon, after art class, Mrs. Winters stopped him at the door. "Barron, I wanted to thank you for your contribution to the Educators Assistance Fund." He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. What do you mean?" "I heard about the art exhibition," she explained, her eyes searching his. "It was a wonderful idea, and it raised a lot of money for teachers in need. I'm truly grateful." He forced a smile. "Oh, yeah, it was a school project." "I see," she said slowly. "But I also heard that you were the artist behind the paintings." He panicked. No, That's not true. I just helped with the organization. Mrs. Winters raised an eyebrow, her expression skeptical. Really? Because I heard that the paintings were quite remarkable, and I know how talented you are, Barron. He felt trapped, cornered. He couldn't lie to her, but he couldn't reveal the truth either. I just wanted to help, he stammered. I saw how hard all the teachers work, and I wanted to do something to show my appreciation. Mrs. Winters softened, her skepticism replaced with warmth. That's very kind of you, Barron. But you don't have to go to such lengths to show your appreciation. Just being a good student is enough. She paused, her gaze unwavering. Are you sure you didn't have anything to do with the art? He hesitated, then shook his head. No, Mrs. Winters. I promise. She studied him for a moment, then sighed. Okay, Barron. I believe you. He breathed a sigh of relief, but the tension lingered. He had managed to deflect her suspicions, but he knew it was only a matter of time before she discovered the truth. He had to be more careful, more vigilant. The closer he got to helping her, the more perilous the situation became. The fear of being exposed was a constant companion, a shadow lurking behind every smile and every kind word. As the weeks passed, the Educators' Assistance Fund began to make a tangible difference. Teachers who were struggling financially received grants to help with rent, medical bills, and other essential expenses. The mood in the school improved, and a sense of camaraderie developed among the faculty. Mrs. Winters, however, remained unaware of the source of the fund. She was grateful for the support, but she still worried about her own financial situation. The rent was still due, and the threat of eviction loomed over her head. Then, disaster struck. A major donor, a local businessman who had pledged a significant sum to the fund, suddenly withdrew his support. The reason was unclear, but rumors swirled that he was facing financial difficulties of his own. The loss of the donor's pledge sent shockwaves through the fund. The available resources dwindled, and the future of the program was in jeopardy. Samuel and Mason broke the news to Barron with heavy hearts. Barron, we're in trouble, Samuel said. The donor pulled out. We're running out of money. What are we going to do? Barron asked, his voice filled with despair. I don't know, Mason admitted. We've tried everything we can think of. We've reached out to other potential donors, but no one is willing to commit. Barron felt a wave of defeat wash over him. He had come so far, worked so hard, and now it was all falling apart. He had failed Mrs. Winters. He had failed his friends. He had failed himself. Maybe we should just give up, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Maybe this was a mistake. No. Samuel exclaimed. We can't give up, Barron. We've come too far. We owe it to Mrs. Winters to keep fighting. But what else can we do? Barron asked, his voice laced with desperation. We've exhausted all our options. There has to be something, Mason insisted. We just have to keep trying. We have to find a way to save the fund. Barron shook his head, his eyes filled with tears. I don't know if I can do this anymore, he said. It's too much. It's too hard. Samuel and Mason exchanged a look of concern. They had never seen Barron so discouraged. They knew they had to find a way to reignite his passion, to remind him of the importance of their mission. The fate of the Educators' Assistance Fund, and Mrs. Winters' future, rested on their shoulders. The weight of failure pressed heavily on Barron. He retreated into himself, spending hours alone in his room, staring blankly at his unfinished canvases. The vibrant colors seemed to mock him, a stark reminder of his shattered dreams. He couldn't bring himself to pick up a brush, the inspiration that had once flowed so freely now dammed by despair. Seeing their friends spiraling, Samuel and Mason took a desperate gamble. Without telling Barron, they contacted a local news station, sharing the story of the Educators Assistance Fund and the anonymous artist who had started it all. They emphasized the dedication of the teachers and the critical role they played in shaping young lives. "We can't reveal the artist's identity," Samuel told the reporter. "But we can tell you that he's a young man who truly cares about his community and wants to make a difference." The news station, intrigued by the heartwarming narrative, agreed to run the story. The segment aired during the evening news, showcasing the artwork, the students, and the plight of the struggling teachers. To Barron's astonishment, the response was overwhelming. The phone lines lit up with calls from people offering donations and support. The Educators Assistance Fund's website crashed under the weight of traffic. The story resonated with viewers, striking a chord of empathy and gratitude for the often underappreciated heroes of education. Sitting alone in his room, Barron watched the news segment with a mixture of disbelief and awe. He couldn't believe that Samuel and Mason had gone to such lengths, and he was overwhelmed by the outpouring of generosity. He received a frantic phone call from Samuel. "Barron, you won't believe what's happening. The fund is exploding. People are donating left and right." "But I didn't do anything," Barron stammered, still processing the situation. "You inspired them," Mason chimed in. "Your art, your intentions, it all resonated with people. They want to help. They want to show their support for the teachers." The reality of the situation began to sink in. He hadn't failed. His efforts, though seemingly defeated, had sparked something larger than himself. He had ignited a movement, a wave of compassion that was sweeping through the community. Inspired by the renewed hope, Barron decided to take an even bolder step. He agreed to a live interview on the news, still protecting his anonymity but sharing his passion for art and his belief in the importance of education. He spoke eloquently about the challenges facing teachers, the sacrifices they made, and the profound impact they had on the lives of their students. His heartfelt words resonated with viewers, further fueling the surge of donations. In the days that followed, the Educators Assistance Fund flourished. The initial goal of $3,200 was quickly surpassed, and the total continued to climb, reaching an astonishing $12,000. Barron, overwhelmed with gratitude, felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had found his voice, not just as an artist but as an advocate for those who dedicated their lives to shaping young minds. He was no longer just the president's son, he was a catalyst for change, a beacon of hope for his community. With the Educators Assistance Fund overflowing with donations, the committee, comprised of Mr. Reed, Mrs. Henderson, and a few other trusted teachers, faced the daunting task of allocating the funds. They decided to prioritize teachers who were facing immediate financial hardship, ensuring that the money would have the greatest impact. Unbeknownst to her, Mrs. Winters was at the top of the list. Her situation had grown increasingly dire, and she was only days away from being evicted from her apartment. She had confided in Mrs. Henderson, her voice laced with desperation, fearing she would soon be without a home. When Mrs. Henderson informed her that she had been selected to receive a grant from the Educators Assistance Fund, Mrs. Winters was overcome with emotion. She couldn't believe that someone, somewhere, cared enough to help her. "I don't know what to say," she said, her voice trembling with gratitude. "I feel like I've been given a second chance." The grant was enough to cover her back rent and ensure that she could stay in her apartment. She felt a profound sense of relief, a weight lifted from her shoulders. She could finally focus on her teaching, on her students, without the constant worry of financial ruin. However, the help was not just monetary. She also received emotional support from Mrs. Henderson and the other teachers. They reminded her of her value, her passion, and her unwavering commitment to her students. She realized she was not alone in her struggles. Mrs. Winters returned to her classroom with a renewed sense of purpose. She was more dedicated than ever to her students, knowing that they, too, might be facing challenges she couldn't see. She also felt a deep sense of gratitude towards the anonymous artist who had inspired the community's generosity. She longed to thank him, to express her heartfelt appreciation for the difference he had made in her life. Meanwhile, Barron watched from afar, his heart swelling with pride. He had achieved his goal. He had helped Mrs. Winters, and he had done it without revealing his identity. He knew that the road ahead would not be easy, but he was committed to continuing the Educators Assistance Fund, to ensuring that teachers received the support they deserved. He had discovered his passion, his purpose, and he was determined to make a lasting impact on his community. Despite his best efforts to remain anonymous, the truth had a way of surfacing. One afternoon, while cleaning up the art studio, Mr. Reed accidentally left one of Barron's sketches, a detailed rendering of the Washington Monument, on his desk. Later that day, Mrs. Winters stopped by the studio to thank Mr. Reed for his support. She noticed the sketch and was immediately struck by its beauty and familiarity. She recognized the unique style, the delicate lines, the unmistakable talent. A wave of realization washed over her. She remembered Barron's hesitation, his averted gaze, his awkward denials. It all made sense now. He was the anonymous artist. He was the one who had started the Educators Assistance Fund. Tears welled up in her eyes. She couldn't believe that someone so young, so privileged, could possess such compassion and generosity. She felt a deep sense of gratitude, a warmth that radiated from her heart. She immediately sought out Barron, finding him in the school library, engrossed in a book. She approached him hesitantly, unsure of what to say. "Barron," she said softly. "Can I talk to you for a moment?" He looked up, startled. "Mrs. Winters, is everything okay?" She smiled, her eyes filled with warmth. "I know," she said. "I know about the art. I know about the fund. I know it was you." Barron's face paled. He had been exposed. All his efforts to remain anonymous had been in vain. He braced himself for her anger, her disappointment, her judgment. But instead, she reached out and took his hand. "Thank you, Barron," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Thank you from the bottom of my heart." He stared at her, dumbfounded. "You're not angry?" She shook her head. "Angry? I'm honored. I'm amazed. I'm so proud of you." She explained that she had figured out the truth from the sketch, from the way he had acted, from the incredible generosity of the donation. "You're an extraordinary young man, Barron," she said. "You have a gift, not just for art but for compassion, for making a difference in the world." Barron felt a wave of relief wash over him. He had been so afraid of being exposed, but now he realized that it was the best thing that could have happened. He could finally share his secret, his passion, with the person he admired most. The revelation brought Barron and Mrs. Winters even closer. No longer bound by secrecy, they could openly discuss the Educators Assistance Fund, brainstorm new ideas, and celebrate their shared success. Mrs. Winters, energized by her newfound security and inspired by Barron's dedication, took on a more active role in the fund's management. She became a mentor and advocate for other teachers, sharing her story and encouraging them to seek support when needed. She spearheaded new initiatives, such as workshops on financial literacy and stress management, providing teachers with the tools they needed to thrive both professionally and personally. Barron continued to paint, his art now infused with even greater passion and purpose. He used his talent to raise awareness for the Educators Assistance Fund, creating new pieces specifically for fundraising events. His art became a symbol of hope and resilience, a testament to the power of compassion and the importance of supporting those who dedicate their lives to educating future generations. He also found a new sense of confidence and self-worth. He was no longer just the president's son, he was Barron, the artist, the advocate, the friend. He had discovered his true identity, his unique voice, and he was using it to make a positive impact on the world. The Educators Assistance Fund became a model for other schools and communities across the country. People were inspired by the story of Barron and Mrs. Winters, and they replicated their efforts, creating similar programs to support teachers in their own communities. The president, initially surprised by his son's clandestine activities, eventually came to admire his passion and dedication. He publicly praised Barron for his commitment to education and his efforts to support teachers. In the end, Barron's act of kindness had created a ripple effect, spreading hope and inspiring change far beyond his school and his community. He had learned that even the smallest act of compassion can make a world of difference, and that the power to make a change lies within each and every one of us. The final scene depicts Barron standing in front of his easel, his brush poised over a fresh canvas. He's no longer sketching the stoic monuments of Washington, D.C., but rather a vibrant depiction of the White House, bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun. This time, however, it's not just a building, it's a symbol of hope, of kindness, and of the unwavering belief in the power of the human spirit. As he adds the final strokes, a smile spreads across his face, a smile that reflects not just his artistic talent, but his profound understanding of the true meaning of service and compassion. He knows that his journey is just beginning, and that he has the power to continue making a difference, one brush stroke at a time. He has found his purpose, his voice, and his place in the world. The legacy of hope, ignited by a young artist's act of kindness, will continue to shine brightly, illuminating the path for future generations to come.